Welcome, everyone. We are welcoming you to this new week of our conversation series on scalable interaction paradigms in pervasive computing environments. And today we are welcoming our guest, Adam Williams, and he is the guest of Florian Niebling and Lukas Plabst, who will be introducing him and will be moderating today's session.
All right, thank you. So thank you, Adam, for giving this talk today. So like Susanna already said, Adam is a member of the Natural User Interface Lab at the Colorado State University in Fort Collins. And his talk today will be about challenges and sort of an outlook about multimodal interaction in the field of immersive analytics. And of course, Adam will do a much better job at introducing himself than I will. So I'm going to hand it off to Adam.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Happy to be here. I am a PhD candidate working with Francisco in the Natural User Interaction Lab. This talk will start by covering some of the general research that we do in the lab, and then end with some research that we just completed in Immersive Analytics this month. So we're pretty excited. Should I go ahead and share my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So here's our lab. If any problems pop up, somebody ping me, please. Francisco is the PI of this lab. He was unable to attend today, so I'm helping him out. So the themes of research in this lab are looking at 3D user interfaces, and we kind of cover a spectrum, but mostly we're looking at multimodal interactions, and more recently we're transitioning to how people multimodally interact in complex domains, and we're using Immersive Analytics as the complex domain. It provides sort of a nice platform where interactions with visualizations can be a little bit more demanding than a simple environment. We started using cubes and basic objects, and the more complex environment is giving much more interesting results. So we're trying to figure out how people want to or should interact in these environments. We're also looking at what sort of displays can we use or feedback mechanisms can we do to improve their performance, including how do we manage clutter or space in their environment. The spectrum of this research is we sort of start on the behavioral side, doing elicitation or discoverability studies and user observations. And then parts of our lab are moving into sort of adaptive user interfaces or conversational agents. And next semester, I'll be transitioning to emotion recognition in AR, which is pretty exciting. So why AR VR? Is it a better mousetrap? Well, it's potentially the next computing platform, and it looks like it's developing some momentum, but interactions in it are difficult. When we transitioned from using a mouse and touchpad from a laptop to like a touchscreen phone, the interactions are pretty similar. You can press on buttons, they open. But when you move to augmented reality environments or virtual reality environments, the interface is entirely different. Now we have 3D space to interact in. A lot of the techniques that we currently use still are using buttons and interactions from the desktop, but the mouse is gone. Often there isn't a keyboard. So what sort of input devices or input modalities are going to be best for this emerging environment? And to examine that, we're working in Immersive Analytics, which is a pretty exciting sub area to research right now. It's really emerging as these technologies become more prevalent. The stereoscopic view of three-dimensional data is really interesting. Previously, we were looking at three-dimensional data on two-dimensional displays, and that research doesn't always pan out well. It's difficult to navigate 3 dimensions and a 2D monitor. But once you are able to display it in 3D space, the navigation interactions can become a little bit more intuitive and natural feeling to users, kind of increasing their engagement and improving their understanding of the visualizations. But we're still not sure which interactions are best for facilitating this. So some issues that we've been running into is these environments can be complex. Raycasting is a really common means of interaction. It's where we are starting at, and people struggle to use it. People have never used raycasting when thrown into an AR environment. Can really take some time to figure out how to line up the raycast cursor with targets and how to pinch them. The pinch being the selection gesture in AR. In VR, it's a little bit easier because you have a controller, but it's still a different kind of interaction mindset that people take a minute to get used to. So things that we have been noticing is people without any experience in stereoscopic displays really have a difficult time beginning interactions. When starting our studies, we've seen that just getting people to the point where they can use the raycast selection pinch to press a button takes 10 minutes or more. And at that point, they might already be feeling fatigued from the effort they put in learning the first interaction. So that's our case. We want to improve these so that people can navigate with similar performances they do with mouse and keyboard on a 2D monitor. We are currently comparing VR and AR. Most of our work has been in AR, but we're examining differences between AR and VR to see what sort of interaction techniques we can grab from VR, which is a more established field and has more interaction techniques sort of already developed for it. So this is really, we're working on the barriers of interaction and not the barriers of understanding. And that's sort of important to bring up because a lot of work in visualization displays deals with how people understand the display, but not many works are looking at how people navigate the environment the display is presented in. So both are critical, but being a multimodal interaction lab, we're excited to be working on the goal of sort of execution, which historically has been under-researched in immersive analytics. This can be seen in sort of the lack of interactions done in VR and AR, raycast being the most common, minimal work in AR in general, limited micro gesture use, a couple of gesture studies, but really this is all sort of a new domain. So what are the challenges of interacting in AR and in multimodal environments? This first part covers our work on basic environments where we were just asking people to translate objects that were, or manipulate objects that were very simple. So we used a cube. We ran the study with animated commands and with text-based commands. So in one version, we would prompt users to interact by asking them to move the cube left. And this would be shown on their screen, and we talk to them. They'd produce a input proposal, either gesture only, speech only, or gesture and speech, and then we move on to the next command. So this was an elicitation study we did. The commands we examined were translations, rotations, and scale, and then select, create, and destroy. And we ran both because it's really difficult to elicit multimodal inputs. A lot of work in elicitation has done gestures or sort of body interactions with the environment, but once you start adding speech, the priming of how you display the referent can be really tricky. Showing text, people repeat it. Showing animations, they're difficult to interpret. Animating create or select is really tricky, where animating move left is not. So transitioning into multimodal elicitation from unimodal or from gesture interactions only was a major sort of design issue that we're still working through. So we ran it both ways to try to minimize the speech priming from the text and any sort of priming that animations would cause, where participants might mirror the interaction. As an example, if an object is shown scaling up and out, people's scale interaction they propose would be diagonal, matching the direction of movement. So kind of aggregating the results of both studies, we found people really like gestures for direct manipulations. They're pretty intuitive, especially when interactions are grounded in real world physics. Abstract commands are much more difficult. There's very little agreement among participants as to how you should execute an abstract interaction. At the time of one of our studies, the Avengers movie had just come out, so people were snapping a lot. We got reasonable agreement on create, but that was just a byproduct of a movie that was out at the time. So abstract commands are hard to elicit. And then when we're looking at multimodal interactions, their strengths kind of show up when you need a little bit more precision in your interaction. So gestures are great if you're rotating in kind of a macro manner, but rotating a specific number of degrees or scaling by a certain size is difficult in gesture interactions. We also found that gestures precede speech in most cases, which is not directly relevant to this talk, but it's really interesting because it can help us sort of develop better recognizer systems. Out of the study, we found most people used open hands when translating objects. They would pinch the object or use one finger when telling it to rotate. And this would either look like reaching out and grabbing part of the object and moving it, or indirectly just kind of signaling what you wanted the object to do. We found a little bit of legacy bias, which is interaction technique from sort of an existing platform that spills into an elicitation proposal. And that was in the bloom gesture from the HoloLens and the shrink and zoom gesture from the iPhone. Also, people very rarely used bimanual gestures, but when they did, it was always mirrored. This lack of bimanual use is probably due to the size of the object we were using, which was maybe a 4" by 4" cube. So over the study, we found that animations versus text as reference also impacts not just like the proposals that people are generating, but also their difficulty in generating these proposals. And this is, we believe this is related to the priming that's caused by the reference. So when you're doing gestures, it's a lot easier to use an animate. It's easier for participants to propose a gesture based on an animation than text. When they see text, they sort of have to interpret it and then visualize what's going on and execute their gesture based on that. And that can be seen in the gestures and speech and the gesture condition alone. When using speech, we found kind of not a strong difference, and we're looking into why that was. So out of the early elicitation studies, we're suggesting that people use unimodal and multimodal interactions, and that personal preference plays a large role into usage, but this personal preference might be minimal. It might be the difference between pinching and using a finger, but the general motion is still pretty similar across participants. So it's really just allowing different hand shapes, which would also fit environments where objects have a lot of different shapes, because the gestures that people would guess to use will be impacted by the affordances or visual representation of the objects they're interacting with, which is the leverage affordances. Just sort of, if you know what objects you're going to be interacting with, you'll know sort of what hand shapes people are most likely to use. So that was all great, but how does this transfer to complex environments? And we haven't figured it out yet. We tried to run an elicitation study in Immersive Analytics, and it really did not work. We did it sort of semi-interactional, so participants could use raycasts or basic grabbing gestures to translate, rotate, scale objects, and then axis selection and changing the visualization or colors. We were trying to leverage the Wizard of Oz design, but the interaction difficulties that people encountered just learning how to translate objects in the environment kind of stopped them from being able to remember or generate commands to use for the elicitation part. So we instead ran a comparison study where we set participants up in the same environment with the raycast interactions using a HTC Vive VR display and a HoloLens 2 display. And we were just seeing how people navigate and interact with the environment differently to get a better idea of how we can train them up on the environment and improve interactions to where maybe multimodal elicitation in IA is possible. So we find that AR really changes how people interact. Seeing the real world caused a lot of variation in how they navigate and position objects or just move through their virtual space. This will be elaborated on. This is the preview. These interactions frustrated some users, even causing some users to just not be able to perform tasks in the study. For immersive analytics, most of our participants would rather VR unless they're in-person collaborating. They felt like seeing the real world was too much distraction when their task was navigating a data display. So across it, we did 3 different segments. We did a training phase, and then phase 1, people had up to 15 minutes to just kind of navigate the environment, ask questions, use the tools, sort of usability evaluation. Phase 2, we asked participants questions and had them answer them based on the data displayed and the tools they had. So they were still navigating the environment, just now they had to answer questions instead of generate them. And what we saw is that in AR, people took a lot longer to train. This wasn't just on the pinch interaction, but this was like across the board. It took longer for them to figure out how to use annotation tools. So we provided some highlight options, a text box, some detail on demand and mean and median metrics. And it took participants a long time to figure out how to even use these tools. Where in VR, people were picking it up a lot more quickly. We think that this was mostly impacted by their immersion. In VR, people were much more engaged with the environment, and that sort of resulted in them generating less questions because they're more excited to be interacting during phase 1. But also, they increased engagement might have helped them sort of through this training process, finishing it more quickly. In phase 1, we can see similar wide time variation where people in AR either chose not to navigate the environment and requested to exit early or really struggled with interactions in the environment. In VR, people were pretty consistent. They were able to navigate the environment. While not really generating questions, they did use most of the tools provided and navigate the visualization states almost entirely, where AR might have used 2 or 3 of the 5 tools provided and 4 of 6 of the visualization states. In phase 2, similar trends, AR less able to answer questions. If they started not answering enough questions correctly, we'd ask easier questions and they would still kind of struggle with answering them, sometimes leading them to skip a number of questions and leave the session early, or again, requesting to just not participate further in that phase of the experiment. In VR, everybody answered questions, not all at the same level of accuracy, but people were able to answer the questions and continued to the end of the session. 2 participants even extended the session by, I think, 3 minutes and 6 minutes because they were just really enjoying the interactions, and they were really spending a lot of time trying to answer the last question we asked them. And this, the last graph is sort of the average, but yeah, so people in VR did spend more time in this environment than they did in AR, sort of by personal choice. Now we're going to go through some of the differences in how they set up the environment. In VR, people made the visualization, which was a scatter plot, much larger. They set it kind of at strange positions. So all participants were sitting in front of a desk, and in AR, people would use a smaller visualization and place it on top of the desk in front of them. And then any other tools provided would be placed sort of around that desk. In VR, participants would use a much larger visualization, put it a little bit further away, and at different angles, they might have it kind of up or down below where their center of view was. And then with the tools, the same thing. They were more likely to move them to different places and place them at higher or lower angles. We think this was largely caused by seeing the desk. With the like seeing a table in front of them sort of overrode the AR's ability to really utilize the VR space, or virtual space fully. And this, when you have a bigger visualization, you move things further. So in AR, people had smaller visualizations and moved them less in general. They also used less annotation tools. So these would be the highlights or the text and tree fields, and they would move them less. In VR, people were more likely to use all the tools and to really move them around as they were navigating the data, because they're just more engaged and more interactive while in the system. Rotations were different in sort of an opposite way. In AR, people had the visualization in front of them. If we ignore X and Z axis rotations and just look at Y was the yaw, and they were very likely to just grab the corner of the rotation or raycast grab and move it around to view different sides of the visualization. Where in VR, people stood up or kind of like would look around the data, and their responses were generally, it felt easier for them to move their head to navigate multiple axes of rotation at once to get a different view of the environment than to grab the object itself and move it. These differences stretched a little bit into the NASA TLX scores, but not hugely. Most categories were very similar. In AR, people were a little bit more confident, but we have a pretty small sample size, so we're not very sure of that result. But in VR, people had more mental demand, and we think this is back relating to those AR participants that just kind of checked out of the study. They were frustrated with the interactions, or they didn't quite figure out how to navigate the environment. So VR participants being more engaged, spending more time in the environment, use more interactions. And then physical demand, sort of top middle. AR was higher, which you would sort of expect when using mid-air gestures. In VR, people could raycast with the Vive controllers. With the Vive controllers, they would hold them closer to their body, and the visualization was further away. So they're really utilizing like more of the raycast functionality. In AR, people really put the visualization close. So all of their interactions were closer, but they also held their hands out a little bit further towards the visualization. So their just whole interaction setup was different. And then we have two videos of the environment. I don't think we need the audio, but yeah, so this was not the lab, this was my house, but we have the visualization, and they can manipulate it using various handles. One of the annotations was a text box. It would pop up a virtual keyboard, or they could use dictation to fill it out. We're using the image targets on the table to synchronize AR and VR headsets for collaboration, which was not really tackled in this study. When people grabbed objects, they got some feedback that their interaction was successful, and the feedback would change depending on what sort of manipulation they were doing. So that action was the yaw action that AR participants performed much more than VR participants. I'm not sure this really. And then there's one more video slide, and then we can start. Oh, I stopped sharing. Sorry about that. Okay, I'm gonna play this one and then we can talk. One of the reasons we had to synchronize between AR and VR is so that we could use this interesting VR pen made by Logitech in the AR environment. So using the pen with the HoloLens, we sort of had this multiplayer platform. So the input was still being recognized by the Vive, but the synchronization allowed HoloLens users to interact with the midair pen. We tried to use this as one of the tools in the study, but the training difficulties and people getting comfortable in the environment just kind of stopped them from using the pen at all during pilot studies. So we're hoping to run more multi-session studies where we do one training on the environment and then run the actual experiment once the participants more comfortable a day or two later. So those were my slides. I'm going to stop presenting and talk to everyone.
All right. Thank you very much, Adam.
Thanks, Adam.
Of course,
So,
oh, do you want to start with questions?
Yeah, sure. We're starting with questions. So to open up, I have a kind of heretical question. So, what is the actual benefit of doing immersive analytics in AR versus in VR? Because often in immersive analytics, the objects that you interact with have no real natural registration with your real environment. So your real world just acts as a kind of unrelated backdrop for your virtual objects. So what is actually the benefit of doing AR here?
The benefit is in collaboration. So I guess framing, we sort of think that the video pass-through headsets will become more prevalent for these sort of environments where you can sort of use the VR environment, which is definitely more well-suited for immersive analytics exploration. But in conferences or in collaborative settings, like workplace conferences, not academic, where multiple people are interacting with the same environment, the view of the other people that are present is a good game that can be got when using AR. So we're working towards trying to set up how people can use these environments collaboratively, but we're still at the early phases. So we're just seeing how people use these environments individually.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So thanks for your very interesting talk. To give the others some more time to think of questions, I'll ask another one. So you mentioned that when you're doing elicitation studies, that you often get some kind of legacy interactions or gestures as a result. So I was wondering on how you can minimize this effect. So if you want to research new interaction methods and explicitly don't want to have these legacy gestures as a result, how can you achieve that? Do you have some insights into that?
I'll tell you what I know. Yeah, so 3 techniques were originally proposed by Meredith Ringgold when she sort of like generated legacy bias as a term. And those were pairing people in groups, which hasn't seen a lot of work. Production, which is asking people to produce more than one gesture per referent. And priming people with some sort of activity prior. This lab's done one study with production, and we found that it didn't really reduce the legacy bias proposals. But there's some caveats to that. We asked people to produce gestures for the sort of basic translational reference, and then a few others. And the reference like scale that were really heavily biased did have some reduced legacy gestures proposed. But across the board, looking at like all reference, production kind of caused people to maybe generate a novel gesture and then fall back to a different gesture, or just kind of generated more disagreement among the participants. We haven't followed up that work, but we were sort of feeling that reducing legacy bias is difficult, maybe not entirely necessary because of like some transfer learning you can get from previous domains, but that if you really were trying to reduce it, sorting out the commands that were most likely to be biased and then using production or a sort of different technique on those might be one approach, or priming, but we haven't really, we haven't solidly figured it out.
Okay, thank you so much. So I don't have an overview on who is raising their hand. Lucas. Great.
Yes. So
I'll hand the questions over to the audience. Go on.
All right, thank you. So speaking about legacy bias, do you think it could be an intermediate solution to lean into that legacy bias and use like a third-party controlling device or some sort as input? I'm thinking about the Vive Flow, which uses a smartphone as sort of like a touch-based controller and uses the 6 axes of a phone. Do you think that could be a good way, like sort of like an intermediate solution until we find something better, to just lead into the touch-based gestures like zooming with pinching?
Totally. The other day I found out that you can connect a mouse to a HoloLens. It's so much easier interacting in a HoloLens with the mouse. It's was
Really?
phenomenal.
Okay, I have to try that.
But we're not allowed to say that because we're researching new interaction techniques. But yeah, I think the phone-based input is going to be something we see for a while. The interactions are going to be easier and like more graspable by people new to these environments, especially if you're transferring like Pokemon Go on a phone to an AR headset or something. And the computation of the AR headset could also be offloaded to the phone, sort of reducing the bulk of the tech while it's emerging. I hope we're not always tethered to it, but it does seem like the best next step.
All right, thank you. As long as, okay, yeah. Suzanne, you have a question?
Yes, thank you very much for that interesting presentation. I was wondering if you also consider it as a sequential test platform, because if you run studies on gestures or on interaction in general in virtual reality, you have much more flexibility of trying things out, because you can introduce objects and you can introduce environments that are not really there in the physical environment, or you don't want to build in a physical environment, specifically when it comes maybe even to touch of a tangible object. Did you also see this like a stepwise development, like you exploring gestures in VR and then you are translating them into an augmented AR environment, and see, for example, test ecological validity in that sense, that it also works in more physical environments and the same in the virtual environments? Or is it for you more that just comparing AR and VR interaction in this multimodal interaction styles?
Yeah, you got it. We're our next study, we're going to try to connect a leap motion or use a VRO, which I guess is a video pass-through headset. But using the leap motion, we're hoping to get some of the same gestures into the VR headset and render some hands, and then see how that changes these interactions and continue kind of working in that direction. I don't think that's entirely what you were saying. I'm not as up to date on what the entire lab's working on, but I don't see tangibles becoming too much of something that we work with.
And then, if I may, a follow up, I really like this comparison, which is probably not so much of a surprise if you really use it, like this AR and VR using more physical load versus creating more cognitive load, if I'm or fatigue, more probably also with regard to that. So that means you would have to adapt the interaction in both spaces. Do you think that you can create them in a way that for example, in AR, if the physical load is so high because I kind of don't hit it or I don't find the object, so that would mean I maybe need bigger buttons in that sense. So you translate it into spaces that are easier to find or easier to select. So do you also think of making the same representations in an abstract fashion, but then implementing two variants, which is more VR capable in that sense versus more AR capable? Because you're looking at the same explorations of the data, but you might really have to completely redesign it for different environments if you want to reduce the load, the physical and the cognitive.
We haven't thought of that one. That would be a great take to sort of move this research we were thinking of doing the hands in VR and then using the Vive controller in AR to see what that does. But scaling the objects in AR would improve the interactions. We saw in both platforms, selecting like handles or edges of objects was really tricky. So just improving the like size would be a great approach to solving that. I think we're limited by the field of view on the HoloLens. It'd be hard for participants to see all of it, but I think using some sort of video pass through or something, you could work around that.
Thank you.
Right, I'm gonna also ask a follow-up question. Speaking about field of view, you said that the AR visualizations in your study, the participants were made smaller visualizations than in VR. Do you think that might change if you use video pass-through or a headset with a larger field of view, or do you think it was due to some other reasons?
Yeah, I'm working through that, so I'll tell you my thought process now. I was writing this up, like doing results yesterday. At talking to the participants after the study, none of them mentioned field of view as a limitation, but I wouldn't really expect them to, because that's not something participants would be super aware of unless they're researching this. We did have some AR participants. We tested 6 people in AR, and maybe 2 of those and 1 or 2 of the pilot participants wanted the ability to scale the visualization to the size of the room, to walk around it instead of being able to sort of move it themselves. So I think with that, like the field of view is going to be maxed out anyway, so I'm not sure how much that mattered to them. I'm wondering if it was more, some people were talking about like the size of like the 2-dimensional visualizations they normally interacted with, and with the desk in front of them, I think they were just trying to match as much familiarity and size as they like shape as they could. But that's speculation.
Right, thank you for your thoughts. Are there any other questions or? All right, I think Christoph.
Yes, thank you. It's a little bit of an oddball question, I think, from my side, but thank you, first of all, for the very interesting talk. When you talk about gestures, have people studied also gestures made by people who are very good at, displaying a wide variety of gestures? People, for instance, proficient in sign language.
I haven't read any papers that have tried to generate gestures from participants with sign language backgrounds. I have seen papers that use expert design, where they have some well-known researchers implement 10 or 12 techniques and then trim them down based on how people use them. But yeah, the sign language would be interesting. They would probably also be better able to manage the fatigue that comes with using gestures.
Yes, or people that are very proficient or have been training a lot on doing the gestures. I think often the studies are looking at novices. I wonder what if you don't do that? What if you look at the experts? But that's just a side question. Thank you very much.
Of course, and I think that I think that's one of the things we're seeing with immersive analytics. Novices might not be the applicable demographic. These environments being more complex seem like something people would build up over time. So yeah, transitioning out of novices is a goal.
All right, as long as there are no other questions, I'm going to follow up with one. When you were asked about the differences, so when Florian asked why should we do immersive analytics in AR anyway, you mentioned collaboration. Do you think that using big gestures and gesturing with your hands a lot might impact like the social acceptance of a collaborative setting when all the people are standing around going like this all the time? Or do you think that's not an issue?
Yeah, big gestures are an issue. They're tiring. I think in collaborative environments, if we're assuming that the sessions are shorter and people are sort of taking turns interacting, larger gestures might be able to communicate more directly what somebody's doing, or like what they're intending for other people in the room to understand about what they're doing. So there could be some benefit. But yeah, I think across, like, outside of like an environment where people are working together on the same project, I think big gestures are going to be really uncomfortable for a lot of people. And they're going to want to not do it. Micro gestures with like wrist trackers seem like an interesting alternative, where you could maybe be a lot more discreet with your interactions while you're in the environment.
All right, thank you. So Albrecht has a question.
So first, thanks of all for sharing your insights with us. And I'm thinking more on the method side, the methodological side. And I think when we go to immersive settings, when we move, I sometimes feel the sort of standard methods we use for evaluation don't really work well. And I think you just had sort of micro gestures may work, but the bigger ones are tiring. But we don't capture that too well, because we do sort of the shorter sort of evaluation rounds. And so what are your thoughts on if we sort of go for new evaluation methods? What would be sort of the main things we should change? And I think this is probably us as reviewers, when we look at things people try to publish, but also us as researchers trying to publish things. And I think that the very practical thing is we do a lot in another project in that space, and it's really very often you get reviews that say, oh, it is not a standardized way you're evaluating it. So I think given you have sort of this broad range of things, so what do you think with regard to, do we need new ways of evaluating that stuff where we have to agree as a community in a way, or will this just emerge?
I'm parsing what you said. I think a lot of the things that we've sort of been experimenting with are different ways to test these environments. And we are seeing a lot of issues with how we're testing them, like with the priming and the elicitation and the like kind of struggles in the immersive analytics environment. We asked them questions, but we're not going to look at the accuracy of their responses, because people are pretty bad at answering questions. Some people answered them quickly and confidently, and we took that as a good sign, but generally people were kind of struggling. So I think new methods of evaluation are definitely needed. I'm not sure what those are for gestures. I think within immersive analytics, I've been seeing people try to use like longer term goals, like how much information they retained after a session, or like retesting them at a future date. But for the interactions themselves, we need new methods. I'm not sure what they are.
Yeah, I think if I may follow up, I think the thing you brought up with basically retention over a longer term, or basically ability to find things, this is so dependent on content very often. And I think also, I think the other thing we see is the number of people you can really sort of realistically run in such a study. I think basically if you run 50 in an immersive environment, that's like a hell of a lot of work. But then if you look at the number of parameters you have, if content comes into play, you probably need much bigger numbers, which I think is not realistic. So I think that's why I think I don't have an answer either, but I think it's something we really have to think about, if we can further sort of dissect it in sort of smaller parts. We could probably evaluate sort of, and I think there I like the hint you had, sort of micro gestures along these lines. I think there may be more from an analytic way also looking at some of it. Thank you.
So are there any more questions? Someone has a follow-up question, maybe? So I would like to know, you were talking a lot about maybe not explicitly but implicitly about the comparability of AR and VR, and I think that if you're using the HoloLens, that your hardware is going to be very different on these both sides. So could you talk a bit about a comparability of these two? So I assume if you use the Vario, for example, with the video see-through device, that you have a lot closer comparability between the two worlds. So how can you do a comparison with two very different hardware settings in a valid, comparable way?
I think using the VR is the best bet, because then we can keep interaction techniques and display pretty constant and just affect how much of the real world they see. Within our study, the HoloLens struggled on updates. So whenever somebody changed the visualization, there was like a perceptible lag before it would render the new visualization. And in VR, it was a little bit more smooth. Like you were saying, also just the like inputs were different. Yeah, I think we need to move into one device that we can use for both settings to try to hold that more constant.
Yeah, thanks, Albrecht.
If I may take sort of this question also to the area where our the SPP, the priority program we're running. So I think it is really about sort of also bigger scale things. And looking back at my personal first immersive experience, they were in caves. It was not head mounted. And so also we did over the last year some stuff with projected augmented reality. And now I think a lot of the ideas we see with once it becomes collaborative, I think a lot of the struggles we have once we put HoloLenses on people, try to synchronize what they see, etc. So we would get this for free in a way if we would use projection in the environment. Or if I think in a cave, you don't get it really for free. You have to render it at least for two people. But I think sort of, but my feel is at the moment, the excitement has really sort of gone completely away from environment-based things to head-mounted displays. And so what is your take on it? Did you even consider at some point to look at things that are not head-mounted, or is it just at the moment, I think, is it the promise that those devices will be fine eventually and the other stuff is just too much effort?
Not a great answer. I was researching with what we had in the lab. We don't have a cave setup, but we had a bunch of these like consumer headsets. So I used them. I hear what you're saying. It was incredibly difficult to synchronize devices and to keep them synchronized. More examination of like sort of the like projection is sorry, really good approach. I was thinking, there's a museum that just opened near me that's like an interactive exhibit with a bunch of physical art, and they didn't do sort of anything with projection or interactive display. So I think just even within society, I don't think we're doing it enough.
And you do not very often hear the phrase, with a cave, you get it for free. So that's very, very nice. Thanks. So any more questions for Adam? Susanne?
Just maybe continuing on the question of the load, even though we might think that this physical and mental load might go a little bit away with maybe the evolvement of technology, I was wondering if there will be more metrics than efficiency. So far, it's all of our metrics and immersions are, maybe error rate, task performance, whatever kind of maybe hit rates or time to completion until I do something. It's all about like, making the human perform well in this environment. But with the metrics, as you say, you often see it's increasing a lot of load. So there's a huge gap between what we think we can do in such an environment, well, this is this cool technology, AR, VR, versus how much load it actually offloads to the human. So we, the technical individuals or companies would say, well, now we have given you this wonderful head-mounted device, or others, why don't you be so excited? Versus say, now my working time, because I'm now a worker, maybe and name a big company, you know, on assembly lines or other areas, where it's actually an additional burden, you know. So do we think we pay attention enough to that? Because we always think we give it to this, you know, well-paid expert that will, of course, now do much better analytics with it. But maybe at some point we are again, you know, offloading a heavy technology to individuals on large scale. So is that kind of a debate going on in your research area?
It should be a debate. It might be that I'm not aware of. I haven't heard much on it, but yeah, I think that's a really good point. The performance metrics, I think within immersive analytics, I've seen people talking about performance metrics just not capturing what's going on incredibly accurately. And I think with our study, at least the VR increased mental load. More work is not great, but the VR participants were just much more engaged, and I think the causes of that mental load were beneficial and not necessarily negative. So I think developing more metrics that can capture sort of these like job satisfaction or how people are comfortable with using these, instead of just can they produce this widget faster, would a really good idea. I'm interested if anyone, this is a huge group, does anyone have any insight on these, like what sort of metrics would people use?
I think the only thing I am aware is robotics. There's ROSA. There's some scales that are more going beyond the classical performance metrics, but I'm also myself seeking for better judgment. As you said, that elements like I call it appreciation of the human worker, as you said, job satisfiability, sort of also take this into account in earlier phases of the research rather than later on finding out it's bad. So that's, but I think it's important and also connects to a previous question, are we really sort of measuring the right thing, and for what kind of tasks are we really designing for? No, I think it's an open area.
So does anybody have a follow-up on the suggestion that increased mental load might actually be a good thing? If that's not the case?
I think there is sort of this very simple curve. I think what we know, I think this is sort of basically you don't want to underload and you don't want to overload. I think this is something we know from traffic psychology, from all basically, and that's sort of researched over 100 years now. But it's, I think once you want to, I think on an abstract level, that's really easy. On a concrete level, creating this flow, I think, and I think in the end it is sort of what other people call flow, is extremely tricky, and it's a holy grail. And I think we have seen that people who do succeed in social networks like TikTok, they have managed to create sort of this a flow on a very low cognitive level, but they have managed to do that you basically lose track of time. But I think designing this is incredibly hard in my view.
Okay, are there any more questions from the audience? PhD students, maybe? It's just the PIs talking most of the time. All right, if that's not the case, let's all thank Adam again. It was a really nice presentation. And I hope that we can get some follow-up from you at a later point in time.